So let me share what I want to say to our students and what I want to say to all of us this morning, including to my own life. We've been in 1 Corinthians. We're still there. Last week we began chapter 4. And let me give you a review about that long. Remember last week the people had divisions in the church in Corinth. And out of their divisions, they were judging Paul and their other leaders. And Paul said, okay, you want to judge us? Let me help you. This is us. And under this is us, he said, if you remember, we're servants of Christ. We're under-rowers, remember that? And we're stewards of the mysteries of God. We're stewards of the truth of God in this book. And we're seekers of God's approval, not man's applause. He says, that's who we are to them. And then he says, but you guys are judging us, and here's why you're getting it wrong. He says, you're getting it wrong because the timing of your judgment is wrong. You're judging us for today and not for that day when we stand before God, when we stand before Christ and give an account of our lives. And he said, the basis of your judgment is wrong. You're judging on the basis of your preferences and the wisdom of the world. And then he said also the motive of your judgment is wrong. You're judging out of your pride. And that's where we ended the message last week, was chapter 7 of verse 4 of 1 Corinthians, when he asked him 3 questions, and the one we centered on was this question: what do you have that you did not receive? And the answer is nothing. They wouldn't have known Christ at all. They wouldn't have had a relationship with him had they not received it, had Paul not come to them and shared the gospel to them. Everything they had was because they'd received it, and everything we have is because we received it. And now Paul is about to drop on them, as one commentator says, a little sacred sarcasm. You know me well enough to know I like sarcasm. Sacred sarcasm or a holy put down. So understand that what he's about to say is all done in a sarcastic kind of tone. Now, for those of you that don't like that are a little sensitive, and when we get back to chapter 4 after Mother's Day, it gets a little more encouraging. But this week, it's sarcastic to them, okay? So understand that. Now, let me explain it this way. When I don't know if they still can do this or not because of political correctness and all the junk of political correctness, but when I was playing ball, in the locker room, there was a lot of sarcasm. I mean, a lot of sarcasm. There was an art to it. And some guys were really good at it. And it was really fun. And sometimes, I've told you this before, but some people were really good at giving it, but couldn't take it. They were thin-skinned, couldn't take it. And I told you before that Nolan Ryan was a great prankster and really good at sarcasm. And his favorite thing to do, I think his favorite thing to do was this. He never had to be the center of attention, didn't care if he was or not. But he would find 2 guys that were thin-skinned and knew they were at each other a little bit. And he would say just the right thing to get 2 thin-skinned people going at each other in a sarcasm. And then they'd just sit back and watch. It was great. Other guys would do things that instead of being verbally sarcastic, they would pull pranks, and the pranks were full of sarcasm. And that's what I want to set the message up as with one of those pranks. I had a teammate named Billy Hatcher. You won't remember him. He was a center fielder. Terrific guy, great teammate, fun, funny, always had a smile on his face. He's the guy, he had a huge home run in the 1986 playoffs for all you old guys, but really good guy. Well, Billy Hatcher was just a fun teammate. And we had a young guy that we picked up. You won't know what this means, but all you need to know is this. We picked him up in the Rule 5 draft, which means he had to stay with our team the whole year. He could not go back to the minor leagues. It was like he was on scholarship almost. So he was going to get big league minimum money, and the kid had never had anything. And he got to our club. He was part of a Rule 5 draft. He knew he was going to be a big leaguer all year. He was never going to get in a game. And day 1, he went out and bought a new BMW. And the veterans were unmerciful to him. Just ripped him because he went, nothing wrong with the BMW, but it was not a wise decision for a young guy like that to make. And they were all over him. But what made matters worse was he bought a really cool chain with the BMW emblem, and he wore it all the time. All the time. So you see where this is headed, right? And every day you go in the locker and he would get dressed. Here's his locker, and there's little shelves down here, and there's lockers and shelves up here, and then you have a place here, and your uniforms are all here. And he would hang his BMW chain and every day right there. Well, the extra players, which he was, had to always be on the field early before the starters. And so the starters had about 30 minutes in the locker room when nobody was in there but the starters. Billy Hatcher was a starter, and Billy Hatcher got tired of seeing this. And I don't know how he did it, but Billy Hatcher went out and he found a chain. This is a chain you could put on the back of a big wrecker and pull a garbage truck. I'm talking a chain. And he made a complete circle with this chain, and attached to that chain, a full-size BMW wheel cover, hubcap. And one day, this young guy left his BMW chain and BMW emblem there, went out to the field, and when he came back from the field, there was a chain you could pull a garbage truck with and a BMW hubcap hanging from it. Now, it wasn't verbal, but Billy's message came through loud and clear: "Kid, you're being ridiculous. This is crazy." And it was great. It was a moment. Well, that's the kind of moment Paul's about to have with the Corinthians. He's going to hang his own chain and BMW hubcap on their lives. And so understand, as I read these verses, he's being sarcastic like that. You're judging me, your pride is ridiculous. And he picks up in verse 8, you're already filled. You've already become rich. You've become kings without us. And indeed, I wish that you had become kings so that we might also reign with you. He says, you Corinthians, you're already filled up. You don't need anybody else. What's the sign that a Christian's full of pride? They think they have it all together. We've arrived. I'm there. I'm fully grown. I'm never going to grow anymore. The second thing is they think they don't need anybody else any longer. He says, you've become kings without us. They weren't living in reality. I mentioned this last week, but we're about to get into some chapters in the weeks ahead where these people are messed up. But yet they don't see it because of their pride. And then he continues. He says, Paul continues, remember the same vein of sarcasm, for I think God has exhibited us apostles last of all as men condemned to death, because we've become a spectacle to the world, both to angels and to men. So that expression there, has exhibited us apostles last of all as men condemned to death, that can be interpreted a couple of different ways, but the New Living Translation really catches the flavor of what he's saying. Let me read it to you from the NLT. Now remember, Paul's talking about the apostles now. You guys are full, you're rich, you're kings without us, but this is us. He says, instead, I sometimes think God has put us apostles on display like prisoners of war at the end of a victor's parade, condemned to die. Now, the Corinthians would have understood that. Rome would go out, they'd fight a battle, they'd win, they'd defeat some enemy, and they'd come back with this triumphal procession, and at the front of the procession would be like the king or some political leaders, and then would come the military leaders, and then would come the victorious soldiers, and at the back end of the procession would be these prisoners of war, many of them possibly headed for death in the arena. And Paul continues, he says, we've become a spectacle to the entire world. He's saying, this is us. Those prisoners at the end, that's us. We've become a spectacle to the entire world, to people and angels alike. And to keep the people pacified, the government will put on this entertainment in the amphitheaters, and they'd put people in there against the gladiators to have them killed, against the lions to have them killed. And some of these soldiers, like Paul is saying he and the apostles are, that's the picture. Like the last ones brought into the arena to be killed in battle. And that word spectacle there, we've been made a spectacle of, is we get our English word theater from that. Paul is saying, in effect, that they've become a spectacle or theater for people and angels alike. He said, that's what we are. You guys, you're all that, but this is who we are. Paul says this is a picture of the apostles, and really it's a picture of all true followers of Jesus Christ. And then he continues, and now the sarcasm's dripping. Listen, you'll hear it as the comparisons go through this. We are fools for Christ's sake, but you're prudent in Christ. We are weak, but you're strong. You are distinguished, but we're without honor. To this present hour, we are both hungry and thirsty, and are poorly clothed, and are roughly treated, and are homeless. And we toil, working with our own hands. When we're reviled, we bless. When we're persecuted, we endure. When we're slandered, we try to conciliate. We've become as the scum of the world, the dregs of all things, even until now. And this is Paul hanging up this big old chain and BMW hubcap to them right here. That's what he's just done. Now look at it on this side of the screen. You're going to see this is who Paul says we apostles are. And over here, Corinthians, this is who you are. First he says, we are fools for Christ's sake. That's who we are. And he says, oh no, but not you guys. You guys are prudent. Can you hear the sarcasm in this? You're prudent. You're wise. You have godly judgment. Not us. Not us. We're fools for Christ's sake. And then he says, we are weak. We're weak, but not you. You're strong. And then he says, we're without honor. We have no honor, but you guys, you're distinguished. Now just look at those things on the board. Can you see the sarcasm in this? He's talking to these people that think they have it all together, and they're a mess. And he says, we apostles, we're fools for Christ's sake, but you think you're so smart. And we're weak, but not you guys, you're so strong, and we don't have any honor at all, but not you guys, you are distinguished. You're something. And then he says, to this present hour we are hungry and thirsty and poorly clothed and homeless and work with our hands. Paul says, this is who we are. This is what our lives look like. We're apostles of Christ. And by the way, when he says work with our hands, that's a real slap in the face. That's to the people to whom he's writing. That would have been like they're the lowest of low. But Paul says to this present hour, as followers of Christ, as apostles of Christ, this is who we are. And then he says, when we're verbally abused, we bless. When we're persecuted, we endure. When we're slandered, we reply as if we were friends of the people slandering us. We become like garbage. We become like trash to the rest of the world. He says, this is us. Come on, fellas, follow us. Really? You want to follow that? Now, let me remind you that you get a picture of the sarcasm. You see what he is saying to them. You think you're all that, and this is us. This is who we are. So let me remind you of a couple of verses we've had earlier in this series in 1 Corinthians. Back in chapter 1, verse 18, the message of the cross is foolish to those who are headed for destruction. But we who are being saved know it's the very power of God. And as the scriptures say, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and discard the intelligence of the intelligent. That's all the way back in chapter 1, verse 18. In 125, he says, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Basically, this sermon is a single point. And we take last week's outline when Paul says, we're servants for Christ. We're stewards of the mysteries of God. We're seekers of God's approval, not man's approval. And now he adds to it, we are fools for Christ's sake. That's who we are. He says we're fools for Christ's sake. Now, what does that mean? That does not mean that we have to go out and act like fools. That's not what he's saying. It does not mean we go out in the world looking for confrontation. A long time ago, we had a men's golf retreat with Dr. DeLoach, and if you've heard me talk about him often, if you don't know him, he was our senior-most pastor. He died in his 90s not too long ago. Very wise man, and I remember we would play golf during the day, and at night he would teach, and then we'd sit around and just ask him questions. And one guy asked a question, and he phrased the question in a sense like he, as a Christian, he should go out and almost live his life in such a way as to pick fights with the world. And Dr. DeLoach gave him a great bit of advice. He said, look, you don't need to go looking for a fight. You don't need to go looking for confrontation. You just go walk with Jesus, and you walk with him, and you walk with him in love, and enough confrontation will find you to satisfy your need for confrontation. It'll be there. Don't go out trying to make yourself look like a fool. You don't need to do that. That's not what God's calling us to do. I read this week about a court jester. A king's fool is what they were considered, a court jester. His name was Nicholas Ferriol. Nickname was Triboulet. He was a court jester to Louis XII and Francis I, in France, obviously. And he was really quick-witted, and he was a fool, but he was no fool. Once he offended a nobleman, and the nobleman threatened to kill him, and Triboulet ran to the king and said, there's a man that's going to kill me, wants to kill me. And the king said to him, don't worry, if he kills you, I'll have him beheaded 15 minutes later. And Triboulet said, well, would it be possible to behead him 15 minutes before? Another time he, in a moment of being the jester, slapped the king on the royal backside, if you know what I mean. And the king was so mad he threatened to execute Triboulet unless he could think of an apology that was more offensive than the act. And he said, I'm very sorry, Your Majesty, that I didn't recognize you. I mistook you for the queen. If that's not funny, there's something wrong. I'm sorry. Another time, Francis I did something that made Francis mad, and Francis did say he condemned him to death. He was going to execute him. But Francis said, out of respect for all your years of service, I'm going to let you choose the method by which you die. And Triboulet responded, good sire, I choose to die from old age. And the king so liked it that he commuted his sentence but banished him from the kingdom. Now, that guy was the king's fool, but he was quick-witted. He wasn't foolish, but he was fun, I think. That's not what God's asking us to be. That's not what Paul is saying here. We're to be considered fools for Christ's sake. but we're not to be real fools. There's a big difference in those two things. But as faithful followers of Jesus, there will be times that the world considers us fools. That's just reality. But we're called not to be ashamed. Not to be ashamed when we serve as servants of Christ and people think we're foolish. Not to be ashamed when we're stewards of the mysteries of God and people think we're foolish. Not to be ashamed because we're living our lives for God's approval instead of man's and people think we're foolish. We're not to be ashamed in those moments. Not to be ashamed because we choose to walk by the truth of this God, led by the Spirit of God, for the glory of God, knowing that there are going to be moments when people try to make us look like fools. And I will say to our students, specifically those that are headed off to college, you will, this isn't a suggestion, you will experience this. You will find some professors that delight in trying to make you feel like and make you look like fools. You will experience some of those people. And when you do, I will just encourage you to remember what Paul said. 2 Corinthians 12:10, he said, I am well content with weaknesses and insults. When that moment comes, you be well content with insults. Instead, you give all you can to your academics and to your studies, and you be the wisest student you can be, the best student you can be. But don't ever forget who created the world you live in and all the knowledge you're learning. God himself created it, and you don't have to be ashamed of anyone. And they try to put you down in some kind of mocking way. In Acts 16, Paul and Silas are beaten with rods and thrown in prison. And in fact, in the deepest part of prison, and while they're there, they're singing hymns to God and they're worshiping. They're fools for Christ. In Acts chapter 5, the apostles have been mistreated. It says, so they went on their way from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they'd been considered worthy to suffer shame for his name. They were fools for Christ. And in this world, students and church alike, when we live according to the truth of this book and the world we live in today, you cannot get around it. If you're living for this book and living for the Lord Jesus Christ, you will be considered fools by many people. We will be. It's just the reality of the world we live in. You know that's true. And a whole bunch of subjects that come right out of this book and the truth of this book. And the question is, are we willing to be considered fools for Christ, or are we going to give in to the world and the so-called wisdom of the world so we fit in and don't have to face the mocking? And that was the problem with the church in Corinth. They'd given in to the so-called world's wisdom instead of the truth of God. There's a man named Nabil Habashi Salama. He's an Egyptian Christian. His picture's on the screen. 62 years old. He paid for most of the building of the only Christian church in his city. His son Peter said this about his dad. He said, his dad said to him, do not think that I'm building this church for here. I'm building for myself a home in heaven. A few months ago, he was kidnapped by ISIS and beaten. And then 2 weeks ago, he was executed by ISIS. His son Peter said, we're telling our kids that their grandfather is now a saint in the highest places of heaven. We're so joyful for him. And I will say, this family, they're fools for Christ in the best kind of way. And if we live it in this culture, you will be considered a fool for Christ. You may not be executed. Might. But you will be considered a fool for Christ. Now let me give you the reason why that should not bother you and that you should be encouraged today as a believer, as a follower of Christ. I want to take you back to chapter 3, some verses we looked at about 3 weeks ago. I want to just remind you what we said about them then. Chapter 3, verse 18 says, let no man deceive himself. If any man among you thinks he is wise in this age, he must become foolish so that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness before God. And then he quotes from 2 Old Testament verses, one from Job and one from Psalms. For it is written, he is the one who catches the wise in their craftiness. And then the verse from Psalms. And again, the Lord knows the reasonings of the wise, that they're useless. What that verse in Psalm 94 actually says is, the Lord knows the reasonings or the knowledge, the wisdom. The Lord knows the wisdom of man, that it's a mere breath. It's just a mere breath. The wisdom of the world, the wisdom of man is, and it's gone. That's it. That's the picture. Here's your worldly wisdom. it's gone. So let me ask you a question. Who's the fool? The one that builds his life on or the one that builds his life on Jesus Christ and him crucified, buried, and raised from the dead? Who's the fool? Who's the fool? And so students, as you move forward into all of our church family, for all of us today, the question is this, because we're all fools. The question is, what kind of fools are we? What kind of fool are you? Are you a fool that's building his or her life on that'll be gone just like that? Are you a fool for Christ's sake, building your life on the truth of this word and Jesus Christ and him crucified? Very simple question. What kind of fool are we? Jim Elliot said it best. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. I don't know about you, but I want to be a fool for Christ's sake, not a fool that's built his life on that we blink and it's gone. What kind of fool are you?